Hello and welcome to this recording of a previously presented session on the special coding instructions for applying step M1. This is part of the ICD-10 Manual Mortality Coding series. My name is Patricia Wood, and I'll be your guide through this presentation. I work with the CDC Foundation as an ICD consultant. I recently retired from my position at Statistics Canada, where I enjoyed a long career gaining extensive experience using both ICD-9 and ICD-10 for mortality classification. This presentation and others in this series are based on the WHO mortality classification rules and guidelines found in ICD-10 Volume 2. These rules and guidelines have been the subject of numerous updates over the years, and we use the 2016 version, which is the most recent and readily available one. It can be found at the link included on this slide. If you use an older or newer version of the rules and guidelines for mortality classification, please let us know. We'll be able to help you navigate any inconsistencies that may pop up in the presentation. This slide illustrates the ICD-10 mortality coding process and is included in all presentations in this series. The rules and guidelines presented are based on information included in the International Form of the Medical Certificate of Cause of Death. The coding applied is all ICD-10 coding from the index and tabular list, and then the rules and guidelines for mortality classification are applied. The rules and guidelines for mortality classification are presented in two sections. Here you'll see that the introduction, information about the International Death Certificate, the basic concepts for mortality classification, steps SP1 through SP5, as well as steps SP6, SP7, and SP8 are all found in ICD-10 Volume 2 in sections 4.1 to 4.2.1. This information has been presented in other presentations in this series. Further instructions in Volume 2 are found in sections 4.2.2 and 4.2.5 to 4.2.9. Included here are modification of the starting point, steps M1 to M3, special instructions on linkages and other provisions, and special instructions for step M4. The special instructions for applying step M1 will be largely the content of this presentation. All right, let's get started. If you're following along in your own copy of Volume 2, 2016, I'm on page 39. Here we read in section 4.2, Coding Instructions for Mortality, we read that selecting the underlying cause of death involves two separate steps. First, identify the starting point. This is done applying steps SP1 through SP8, and as mentioned are the content of other presentations in this series. Next, you are to check whether any special instructions apply to the starting point. If so, the next step is to modify the starting point identified during the selection step. So, what is modification? Modification is defined as one of the basic concepts in section 4.1.3 as special coding instructions on specific sequences and ICD categories may have the effect that a condition other than the starting point is selected as the underlying cause of death for use in statistics. The goal of the work that we do is to produce the most useful mortality statistics for epidemiological purposes and for informing public health decisions. So sometimes we don't stick with the condition initially selected, but rather we modify it by something else on the certificate to get the most useful code for mortality statistics. The modification of the tentative underlying cause involves the application of steps M1 through M4. If you find yourself in section 4.2.2 on page 49, if you're using ICD-10 Volume 2, 2016, you'll read there that the starting point identified using steps SP1 to SP8 is now considered the tentative underlying cause. So I'll refer to that as the tentative underlying cause going forward in this presentation. There may be special coding instructions on the tentative underlying cause or other reasons to modify it. Check whether the tentative underlying cause should be modified by applying these rules described in steps M1 to M3. In this particular session, the application of step M1 special coding instructions will be presented along with examples and explanations. In other words, we'll be focusing on the first one. This is the first instruction specific to step M1. In ICD-10, Volume 2 at Section 4.2.1, we can read the instructions about applying step 1, the first of the modification rules. It says here, check whether special coding instructions apply to the tentative underlying cause. If a special coding instruction applies, assign a new tentative underlying cause according to that instruction. As an aside, if no special coding instruction applies to the tentative underlying cause, you can go on to step M2. Always check whether special coding instructions apply to the new tentative underlying cause. That is, reapply step M1 until no special coding instructions apply to the tentative underlying cause selected. We've said a lot on this slide about special coding instructions. Let's move on and see what that's all about. The special coding instructions start on page 69, and they're found in this format presented on this slide. So in section 4.2.5, you'll find special instructions on linkages and other provisions for step M1. In volume 2, it tells you how to read the special instructions, that the code for the tentative underlying cause is listed in the left-hand column. So on this slide, the code for the tentative underlying cause found in the left-hand column is I71.1, thoracic aneurysm ruptured. If the condition specified in the right-hand column applies, the code in bold is the new tentative underlying cause. So in this case, if you have selected using steps SP1 through SP8, you selected a tentative underlying cause of I71.1, and on the certificate, it's with mention of I71.3, you should apply this special instruction and recode the tentative underlying cause to I715. This new tentative underlying cause, having applied step M1, I71.5, is thoracoabdominal aortic aneurysm ruptured, which you can see is a combination of the two causes to death reported together. Remember, we're always looking for the code for the most useful mortality statistic. Reading on in section 4.2.5, the special instructions on linkages and other provisions, step M1, we're told that there are two types of combinations or linkages in these special instructions. The first, for applying step 1, is the with mention of linkage or combination. This means that the other condition may appear anywhere on the certificate. The other type of combination or linkage is the when reported as a cause of, which means that the other condition must appear in the correct causal relationship or be otherwise indicated as being due to the tentative underlying cause. Further to that, there are two types of with mention of linkages. There's the preference, meaning that the code for the other condition is preferred over the code for the tentative underlying cause. Or the combination, which means that the code for the other condition and the code for the tentative underlying cause combine into a third code. The example I just presented with the tentative underlying cause reported with mention of another code, those two codes combined into a third code, which was preferred. I have on this slide abbreviations for the linkage with mention of an LMP abbreviation and the combination LMC. And I would encourage you to remember those abbreviations for later in our examples. Just a quick aside for any IRIS users listening to this recording. On this slide, a snippet from the IRIS Decision Table browser shows how our first example, where the tentative underlying cause was I71.1, was reported with mention of I71.3, leads to a modification of the tentative underlying cause, preferring I71.5. This is a combination code. Notice on this slide the abbreviation LMC. That tells us that this linkage is a mention of, and there's a combination code. The next few slides will look at the examples included in Volume 2, demonstrating the application of step M1. This first one, as you can see, on line A, we have a myocardial infarction due to, on line B, ischemic heart disease. The codes for this record would be I219 and I259. I hope you'll recognize the format of the codes, the slash, meaning that I've dropped from line A to line B. So this demonstrates, these two codes demonstrate the two causes of death on the certificate. Going back to what you've already learned about selecting a tentative underlying cause, we would have applied step SP3 to get a tentative starting point, or now a tentative underlying cause of I259. Learning what we have about the application of step M1, we now know that we need to examine the special instructions to see whether our tentative underlying cause I259 links to or is combined with the other cause of death on this record, represented by code I219. Below the medical certificate, you'll see a snippet of the special instructions. I've highlighted in yellow the tentative underlying cause, I25 ... so anything in the code category I25, chronic ischemic heart disease, reported with mention of anything in I21 ... acute myocardial infarction, we are to code I21 ... This is an application of step M1, where we're going to link the tentative underlying cause I259 to I219. I219 is our new tentative underlying cause. We will check the special instructions for any further linkages. There are none. So in fact, for mortality statistics purposes, our underlying cause for this record is I219, acute myocardial infarction, unspecified. On the next certificate, on line A, we have recorded liver cirrhosis, and on line B, chronic alcoholism. The ICD-10 codes applied to this example would be on line A, K746, on line B, F102. Applying step SP3, we would select a tentative starting point of F102. Checking for special instructions, we would find one that combines the tentative underlying cause of F102 with K746 to produce the code K703, alcoholic liver cirrhosis. That would, by an application of step M1, become our new tentative underlying cause. Checking for further linkages or modifications, we wouldn't find any, so we would select as the underlying cause of death for this record, K703, alcoholic liver cirrhosis. On the next slide, I'll show you the special instruction that caused this combination code. Here's the certificate is the same. The snippet was too long to put it all on one slide, but here's the special instruction I just applied. For all subcategories of F10, with mention of specifically K746, the special instruction is to combine a tentative underlying cause of F10 with K746 to get the code K703. Okay, just a quick reminder that when you're reading these special instructions, the tentative underlying cause is in the left-hand column with the instruction for your other cause of death code and whether to combine the two codes or prefer the other code. You'll remember that we learned that there were two types of linkages, the with mention of and when reported as the cause of. There are two types of when reported as the cause of linkages. There's a preference, meaning that when the other condition is reported as due to the tentative underlying cause, the code for the other condition is preferred over the code for the tentative underlying cause. Or the combination linkage, meaning that when the other condition is reported as due to the tentative underlying cause, the code for the other condition and the code for the tentative underlying cause combine into a third code. Again, I've included in blue on the slides abbreviations for these linkages. Notice that it's LDP. So this is a linkage when reported as the cause of or due to linkage. LDP and LDC. Here's another example from Volume 2, Section 4.2.2. We're at example 5. Here we have reported on line A, dementia, and on line B, atherosclerosis. The codes applied in this case would be for line A, F03, for line B, I709. Applying step SP3, we would select a tentative starting point of I709. Checking the special instructions for the application of step M1, we find there is one for a tentative starting point or a tentative underlying cause of I709. Notice the snippet on the slide right underneath the certificate. This tells us that when our tentative underlying cause is I70.9, reported as the cause of F03, we should combine those two codes and reselect the tentative underlying cause as code F01, in this case 9. So by an application of step M1, we've combined our tentative underlying cause of I709 and the other condition on the record, F03, to produce the code F019, vascular dementia unspecified. This is considered to be a more useful code for our mortality statistics than the originally selected one, I709, atherosclerosis, or the other one on the record, F03, dementia. On this slide, we'll look at example 6. Notice that recorded alone in part 1 is atherosclerosis. Recorded in part 2 of the certificate is dementia. The codes for this record are I709 and F03, the same codes we had on the last record. However, atherosclerosis is alone in part 1, so applying step SP2, the tentative starting point or tentative underlying cause is I709. Looking at the special instructions, the exact instruction we saw with the last example, when your tentative underlying cause is I709 and it's reported as the cause of F03, you should combine those two codes into a third code. However, in this particular example, I709 is not reported as the cause of F03. Therefore, this linkage is not applicable to this record. The tentative underlying cause does not change. It remains at I709. There are no other linkages, no other special instructions for this record. So the underlying cause of death is I709, generalized and unspecified atherosclerosis. To recap, we've learned that there are special instructions that modify the tentative underlying cause by something else on the death certificate. We've learned that there are two types of linkages, the with mention of and when reported as cause of linkages. And we have also learned that sometimes the modification is to prefer the code for the other condition, and other times the modification is to combine the two codes into a third code. Looking at this slide, something new. In the special instructions on linkages and other provisions for step M1 at section 4.2.5, you'll read, sometimes several special instructions apply to the tentative underlying cause. If so, apply instructions relating the tentative underlying cause to a condition in part 1 before instructions relating the tentative underlying cause to a condition in part 2. On this slide, you'll read the explanation for example 3 in volume 2 at section 4.2.2 applying step M1. Here on line A, we have ischemic heart disease. On line B, atherosclerosis. In part 2, cerebral infarction. The codes applied to the record would be I259 for line A, I709 for line B, and in part 2, I639. Applying step SP3, the tentative starting point is I709. The special instructions for applying step M1 to a tentative underlying cause of I709 include a with mention of linkage with I259 and a with mention of linkage to I639. So there are two valid linkages that apply to the tentative underlying cause I709. One of these linkages is with a condition in part 1, the LMP linkage with I259, and the other is in part 2, the LMP linkage with I639. The instructions for applying step 1 tell us to apply the linkage with the condition in part 1 over a linkage with the condition in part 2. So by step M1, our new tentative underlying cause is I259. There are no further linkages or modifications for this record, so the underlying cause is I259. Chronic ischemic heart disease unspecified. On this slide, we see example 4 from volume 2, section 4.2.2. On line A, cerebrovascular infarction. On line B, atherosclerosis. On line C, hypertension. And in part 2, myocardial infarction. The ICD-10 codes applied to this record would be I639 for line A, I709 for line B, I10 for line C, and I219 for part 2. Applying step SP3, the tentative starting point would be I10. Considering that to be our tentative underlying cause, we would examine the special instructions and learn that I10 links with I639 and I10 links with I219. Again, we have two valid linkages for other conditions on this certificate. However, the linkage between the tentative underlying cause I10 and I639 is in part 1, whereas the linkage with I219, that's in part 2. Our instructions tell us to prefer the linkage or link first with the condition in part 1. Make that linkage first. Therefore, our new tentative underlying cause by an application of step M1 is I639. Consulting the special instructions for tentative underlying cause I639, there are no further linkages or modifications with conditions on this record. So our underlying cause of death is I639, cerebral infarction unspecified. In this example, we see that on line A is ischemic heart disease, on line B, atherosclerosis, and in part 2, myocardial infarction. The codes applied to this record would be I259 on line A, I709 on line B, and I219 in part 2. Consulting the special instructions for applying step M1, we'll find that the tentative underlying cause selected by step SP3, I709, links with I259 in part 1 and links with I219 in part 2. There are two valid linkages, but we will, according to the instructions, link first with a condition in part 1 over a condition in part 2. So our new tentative underlying cause is I259. This is the first time this has happened in the examples we've examined, but when we look at the special instructions for the new tentative underlying cause, I259, there is a linkage, a with mention of linkage with I219. So we apply step M1 again, and our new tentative underlying cause is I219. Checking the special instructions for that tentative underlying cause, there are no further linkages or modifications for this record. So our underlying cause of death for statistical tabulation is I219, acute myocardial infarction unspecified. Another instruction about more than one linkage. If there are several instructions relating the tentative underlying cause to conditions in part 1, then apply the instruction relating to the first mentioned of these conditions, or in other words, the first mentioned linkage. The example on this slide is not found in Volume 2, but rather is a supplementary example to demonstrate the application of this instruction. We have on line A 3 different causes of death, all reported together on line A: hypertension, ASHD, and cerebral atherosclerosis. The ICD-10 codes applied to line A would be I10, I251, and I672. Applying step SP2, the tentative starting point or tentative underlying cause selected is I10. Referring to the special instructions for applying step M1 to tentative underlying cause I10, we see that there's an LNP linkage with I251, reported in part 1, and an LNP linkage with I672, also reported in part 1. We have 2 valid linkages, both reported in part 1. The instruction from the previous slide said that we should link with the first mentioned condition or take the first mentioned linkage. In that case, the linkage is I10 with I251. So by applying step M1, we have a new tentative underlying cause of I251. Checking the special instructions, we find no further linkages or modifications for this record, so the underlying cause selected for statistical tabulation is I251, atherosclerotic heart disease. On this slide is another supplementary example designed to demonstrate the resolution of more than one valid linkage with the tentative underlying cause. On line A, cerebral hemorrhage. On line B, arteriosclerosis, and on line C, arteriosclerotic heart disease. The ICD-10 codes applied to this record are I619, line A, I709 on line B, and I251 on line C. An application of step SP4 gives us a tentative starting point of I709 from line C. Referring to the special instructions for the application of step M1 for a tentative underlying cause of I709, we'll find an LNP linkage with I619, reported in part 1, and an LNP linkage with I251, also reported in part 1. The instruction when there's more than one valid linkage in part 1 is to link with the first reported condition or the first mentioned linkage. In this case, that would be with I619 from line A. Therefore, the new tentative underlying cause by an application of step M1 is I619. Checking the special instructions for application of step M1 when the tentative underlying cause is I619, we find no further linkages, so the underlying cause for statistical tabulation is I619, intracerebral hemorrhage unspecified. And a final instruction for how to resolve more than one valid linkage for the application in the application of step M1. If there are several instructions relating the tentative underlying cause to conditions in part 2, apply the instruction relating to the first mentioned of these conditions. One more supplementary example designed to demonstrate the instruction on the previous slide. On this death certificate, in part 1, on line A, hypertension. In part 2, acute myocardial infarction and ASHD. The codes to apply to this record would be in part 1, I10, in part 2, I219, and I251. By an application of step SP2, the tentative starting point is I10. Checking the special instructions for the application of step M1 to a tentative underlying cause of I10, we notice a valid linkage with I219 in part 2 and a valid linkage with I259, also in part 2. The instruction in such cases is to take the first mentioned linkage, which in this case is with I219. So the new tentative underlying cause as selected by an application of step M1 is I219. In the special instructions for the application of step M1, there are no further linkages or modifications to this tentative underlying cause. So our underlying cause for statistical tabulation is I-219 acute myocardial infarction unspecified. One more supplementary example. On this certificate, in part 1, we have hypertension. In part 2, ASHD and acute myocardial infarction. It may strike you that this is remarkably similar to the previous example. The conditions in part 2 are in reverse order. And when you look for codes, ICD-10 codes to apply to this record, you would have I10 in part 1, and in part 2, I251 and I219. By an application of step SP2, the tentative starting point is I10. Referring to the special instructions for the application of step M1 to a tentative underlying cause of I10, there's a valid linkage with I259, which is in part 2, and I219, also in part 2. We have two valid linkages with conditions in part 2. The instruction is to link with the first mentioned condition. Therefore, by an application of step M1, our new tentative underlying cause for this record is I251. That's the first mentioned linkage. When we go to the special instructions for a tentative underlying cause of I251, there's a further linkage, I251 with I219. So by step M1, our new tentative underlying cause is I219. There are no further linkages or modifications to that tentative underlying cause. So our underlying cause for statistical tabulation for this record is I219, acute myocardial infarction unspecified. That concludes this presentation on the application of modification step M1. Thank you for listening.